Welcome to Legal Nurse Podcast. This is your spot to get inspiration, tips, stories, and guidance to help you in your legal nurse consulting practice. I'm Pat Iyer, the host of Legal Nurse Podcast since 2016. We are among the top 5% of all podcasts in the world in terms of longevity and sharing information consistently week after week with legal nurse consultants. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Welcome to Legal Nurse Podcast. I'm Pat Iyer. We are focusing today on a very important role of the nurse, which is to be a patient advocate. This comes up for us in nursing malpractice cases, in medical malpractice cases, when the attorneys begin to probe about what the nurse did to stand up for the patient, particularly when there's a change in condition. My guest today is going to be focusing on those nuances and how they play out in the legal system. She is a critical care nurse. She has experience being part of a rapid response team. She's a mother. She teaches ballet. And she wrestles with her houseplants. She says she negotiates with her houseplants. And I'm curious about what that means, Catherine. My guest today is Catherine Andrades. Catherine, welcome to the show.
Hi, Pat. Thank you for having me.
We talked a little bit before we started this podcast about being a patient advocate, a universal quality around the world that nurses are expected to fulfill in helping vulnerable people who are part of our healthcare system. So where does that requirement come from, that we are patient advocates?
Foundation for patient advocacy comes out of the ANA Code of Ethics. And we'll break that down in a minute. But what it says is the nurse promotes, advocates for, and protects the rights, the health, and the safety of the patient. It doesn't say if you have time. It doesn't say if your manager approves. It's literally a part of our license. And it does sound straightforward, but in reality, it makes me think of my kids trying to climb a jungle gym. You're trying to grab a grip here, a grip there. You have to move. If you lose a grip, you have to keep climbing. You have to keep climbing until your patient's safe. Back during COVID, I actually worked nights in a hospital in California where the only doctor on site was an ER physician. And technically, our ICU patients belonged to our ICU attending, but he was not in the facility. So if a patient crashed, the right pathway was to call our attending. But in an emergency, a patient needed to be intubated, a patient was coding, it would be a lot more effective to call our in-house physician. So we would call both. We'd have alternate pathways to kind of advocate for this patient. We could get immediate intervention from our doctor who's there on site, but we could also get orders and kind of follow-up intervention from our actual attending. So it kind of shows, I guess, advocacy in practice, and why it's important to understand both as nurses and when we work with attorneys that what's in our policies is not always what's happening at the bedside. Like a juggling act.
I'm thinking about the implications of having one doctor in the building who's supposed to be responsible for assessing and treating patients in the emergency department, and then a critical care unit filled with very sick patients and not having access to an intensivist.
You're telling me.
Say that again?
I said, you're telling me. It was, yeah.
It sounds like a nightmare, Catherine.
It was. Mm-hmm.
And a great example. Just to clarify, we talked about ANA standards. Let's break that down for our audience and explain that abbreviation and what that organization does.
So in America, in the United States, we have the ANA, which is the American Nurses Association. It's our professional voice of nursing. The Board of Nursing is a totally different entity. They're the ones that regulate our licenses. But the ANA is what kind of sets the standards of what defines our ethical, competent nursing. And it's cited a lot, both in boardrooms, in courtrooms, and that line about protecting and promoting the health and safety of the patient, advocacy, helps to give us a benchmark of what reasonable nursing is supposed to be. So they kind of set the rules. The Board of Nursing sets the rules for the game, and then the ANA, the American Nurses Association, kind of shows us how we actually play the game.
You know, the challenge, when I think about this within the context of history, is that for many of our listeners, we came into nursing at a time when physicians were the power structure and could not be questioned. And for many of our listeners in international countries, that's still an issue, as it's still an issue in this country.
Me too.
It sounds to me like the American Nursing Association and other nursing associations have such an important role in supporting nurses so that they feel able to challenge somebody who is in authority or not. It could be a coworker who's telling them to do something that they know is wrong. I know I've been asked to do things that I know are wrong. I'm sure it's happened to you as well.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about a situation where the nurse did not act as a patient advocate when it was important to do so.
I saw this a lot working rapid response, more so than working in the ICU. One that comes to mind was a post-op patient. He was post-XLAB. He was short of breath. He's clearly in distress. His oxygen was dropping. And the bedside nurse had done the first part of advocating for her patient. She had called the physician. She got orders to crank up the oxygen, but she also had 4 other patients. So she's trying to juggle all these patients and she didn't get to call that doctor back and let them know that the patient was getting worse. She didn't call a rapid response. So there was no further escalation, and this patient just kept crashing. And I happened to be on the floor rounding, thank goodness, and I noticed a bunch of people in the room, and I'm a very nosy ICU nurse by nature, so I wanted to know what was going on, and I went in the room, and this patient was actively crashing, and I popped him on the stretcher. I called the doctor and told him we're going to CT. Can you please put the order in? And we found a massive pneumothorax. So we put a big old chest tube in the radiology suite. And if that it's just one of those things that if that nurse had maybe asked for some sort of imaging to see if we could find a cause for the shortness of breath, if we'd advocated further, we could have taken care of this distress further. But if it had been delayed even more, it could have been catastrophic.
And for our listeners who don't know the term rapid response team, could you give us a quick overview of who's on this team? What do they do? Why are they called?
Yes, we are the escalation team in a way. So anyone throughout the hospital that needs help with something that maybe they're not certified to do on their floor, we can come help with. Or if it's an escalation, a patient is actively crashing, a patient is having a stroke, a patient's having a code, we respond to the emergencies and help stabilize the patient. And our team consisted of, at my hospital at least, it was a doctor and a nurse, and then a respiratory therapist as well.
And for those who are listening who don't know, this is an idea that originated from a nurse in New Zealand who I heard speak when I was presenting in Australia at an International Council of Nurses. She came up with the idea. She was forthright and pushed it through in her hospital. And that idea spread literally all over the world from that one nurse who said, we need a rapid response team. and she was able to get it in place.
I didn't know that.
Yes, she was very humble, and she was talking to the group about how she recognized that this was a need. I was in the room listening to her thinking, oh my goodness, the power of one person who can change the world.
Yes. Yeah.
We did a prior podcast on the cardiac arrest concepts, code teams. That was with Mary Beth Kirstein. I know that you've just talked and give us an example of people on the med-surg unit struggling with an emergency. And of course, there was a time in healthcare where such teams didn't exist. And often the first sign of trouble was hearing the announcement for code blue and the patient's room number. Give us the sense of when we are not nurses, we are not proactive, we are not acting as patient advocates. What are some of the consequences of that?
The consequences can be deadly. Honestly, leaving your patient unattended in a way, a lot of that I think stems from burnout in a way. If you're constantly pushing you're trying to manage all these patients all at once, and that's exhausting in itself. And then if you're pushing to try to get orders from a physician who maybe retaliates or they don't answer, it can be exhausting to keep pushing and pushing and get pushback. And I think a lot of nurses, they stop pushing just because they know the answer is going to be no. And it can have deadly consequences for patients. You can have a lot more complications, and it just can be terrible.
If we put this in a medical legal context and we are reviewing medical records in a case where a patient deteriorated, take us through what we should be looking for in the medical record that would tell us that this nurse was having trouble being a patient advocate.
Oh, I would look let me put my brain together for a second.
I know that was not a question that we planned ahead of time.
I have an answer, but it's all jumbled. Let me see. Okay. So every hospital should have a written chain of command policy. They should, and it should spell out exactly how nurses are supposed to escalate. Typically, you go to, as the bedside nurse, you go to your charge nurse, and then you can go to your NP or your physician assistant, and then you'll go to your attending, and then if it's maybe a post-op patient, they'll go to their surgeon. But if we're reviewing a medical malpractice case and this is a potential concern, you can ask for the policies in discovery, just like you'd ask for your MARS, for your staffing grids. Staffing grids would be a really good one to let you know how many patients was this nurse taking care of today. Did they have the time to call and ask for orders? Did they have the time to make the physician come to the bedside? That'll help show kind of what was happening on the outskirts while that patient was deteriorating.
And I know that those policies should be readily retrievable. The attorney has to ask for them. In this country, they can't get anything unless they file suit. All they can get is the medical records. I want to circle back to something that you said, Catherine, about physicians not answering, not returning calls, retaliating. Tell us about how that impacts patient safety.
So in a way in its rawest form, that's bullying. And bullying, I think, kills advocacy faster than anything else can. I had a nasty surgeon that I worked with who would scream and yell if you called him after he left the hospital. And I got to work with him on night shifts, so I would call him in the middle of the night and he would scream and yell even louder. And when he came into the hospital, after you'd called him in, he would throw things across the room. He would make a fuss, he'd make a scene in front of the patient and their visitors. It was full on intimidation. So after a while, the nurses became scared to call him and the patients would suffer. So a patient could be in severe distress and they would do everything in their power to not call this doctor, to not have to deal with his retaliation. And that, I think, tying back to the last question in a way, that fear doesn't show up in your medical records either. This pattern of retaliation, instead, it just looks like nobody escalated on paper. But over time, these people become too afraid to use the chain of command appropriately. And it's, again, it can cause you catastrophic, it can cause catastrophic damages for your patient. The patients can die.
I remember hearing about a situation where a patient and her husband heard their surgeon screaming at the nurses. And they made a decision on the spot that they wanted a different surgeon and fired him because they were concerned by what they were hearing and the way that the surgeon was interacting with the nurses. That's an unusual step, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
However, a very self-protective step, as it turned out, in this situation.
Good for them.
And good for you that you called this surgeon knowing that you were going to become the target of a tirade. Medicine doesn't stop at the end of the 8 hours. It's 24 hours a day. And I know that that is a source of distress for some healthcare providers who don't want the constant demands, and some of them leave the field, some of them do other things. But for the nurse who has to act as a patient advocate, what a
Hello, I'm Barbara Levin, and I am joined today with Dr. Christine Dorman, an advanced critical care nurse practitioner. Dr. Dorman, could you please share what type of program you will be sharing with our audience who will be joining us for our 12th LNC Success Conference, which is November 13, 14, and 15, 2025.
Thank you, Ms. Levin. I appreciate that wonderful introduction. My topic will be the common liability claims against nurse practitioners. What you will learn when you attend my session is why are nurse practitioners now the increased target for litigation claims. I'll be discussing with you the common liability claims, strategies for you to utilize in evaluating claims against nurse practitioners.
Dr. Dorman, could you share what types of takeaways that our audience will have, such as actionable items that they will learn from your program?
I will share with you several actionable strategies that you can utilize when evaluating nurse practitioner claims. Be great takeaways. So come to our program, the Legal Nurse Consulting Success Conference. Taking place when, Barb?
It is November 13, 14, 15, 2025. Please see our link below, lnc.tips/NOV 2025. We look forward to seeing you.
See you there.
allowed you to pick up the phone and call, whereas the people you worked with were not willing to pick up the phone and call?
I was charge nurse, so I feel like I had a little bit more, I don't want to say credibility that night, but they'd showed that they've already used a little step in the chain of command before going straight to him. But I also had seen this happen with the same surgeon over and over, and patients get really, really sick because nurses were afraid to call this surgeon. And in my mind, it was either I call him or this patient goes into respiratory arrest. So I need to call him, and he can scream and yell all he wants. But at the end of the day, this is his patient. It's his responsibility.
Mhm.
And if you don't want a job that requires you to come in outside of your hours, then that might be your own problem to solve.
And ultimately it became the patient's problem and the nurse's problem as well.
Yep. Yes, it does.
So I want to focus on this example because the Joint Commission, which accredits many hospitals in the United States, came out with a standard some years ago that said that the hospital had to have zero tolerance for bullying behavior, the responsibility of the administration to make sure that people were educated, there was remediation, or they were removed from the staff because of their behavior. I've heard of some stories of people who were forced out of their positions because of their behavior. I'm thinking about a cardiothoracic surgeon who stormed into an OR in his street clothes, not in OR garb, to yell at the fellow who was doing open heart surgery. He was removed from staff. That happened in New York State, as a matter of fact. But tell me, that may be a rare exception. Why are healthcare environments still struggling with this issue years after this standard was put in place about zero tolerance?
I truly don't know. I think it personally takes a lot more energy to scream and yell at someone than to just say, okay, I'll be there. Give me a minute, change out of my pajamas. But I think that the remedies that they've been using to try to shut this down, a majority of the time, are ineffective. A lot of times it's a yearly online bullying module or no harassment module. It's a PowerPoint, it's an office meeting, but there's no real backup for the nurses a lot of the times when it is that particular kind of bullying. A lot of times the zero tolerance for bullying is a poster on the wall instead of the leaders actually backing the nurses up when they need to escalate. Instead of nurses documenting or submitting a variance report that this is how they were responded to create a paper trail. I don't think it's addressed appropriately.
I helped an attorney for 3.5 years with an OB case in which the anesthesiologist was a bully. And people did document 38 times in 18 months about her behavior, but she continued on the staff. We know that that was unacceptable. That was one of the things that was brought out in the lawsuit because the hospital claimed that they couldn't hand over those incident reports, which were called verge reports, because they were protected from discovery. There were depositions of nurses who described this doctor's behavior, so we could identify that there were specific things that she said and did that would constitute bullying, and there was no ability of the administration to prove that they effectively changed her behavior. They met with her a few times, didn't keep records, didn't set up a plan that she had to follow, chastised her, and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'll do better," and went right back to her behavior. Which leaves the nurses in a very difficult situation of handling a person who is bullying, and as you pointed out, can then develop a pattern of avoidance. From a medical malpractice perspective, where does that leave the nurse who avoids calling a physician when it's clear that the physician needs to be called?
That nurse she's hold on. That nurse is failing to advocate for her patient. She's going against what's mandated in her license. She still is at fault in that situation. And it's terrible that she's going to get backlash when going to a physician like that. And I wish that there was a way to effectively shut down the bullying in the workplace. It makes it someplace that people don't even want to go to work anymore because they know they're going to be working with that physician that day. And I've been in that situation too. And you dread going to work. You don't want to be there. And then what's the point? but it also places your patients at really high risk for just terrible outcomes, for complications, for everything to go down the drain. But if that, I think also a way that nurses can kind of go around that too is that this physician is going to immediately give you pushback. They're going to give you retaliation. Then go to the next person. Go to somebody else. Usually there's another attending, there's a supervisor, there's their NP or PA a little below them. There's multiple pathways that you can go on to. You've informed this person, they've given you pushback, and now I'm going to move on to the next one.
And let's focus on that a little bit, because that's often a question that comes up in a case. A nurse is questioned in a deposition, a defendant nurse. Who did you call when you got resistance from the surgeon? Where did you go next? Tell us about the chain of command. You mentioned a policy, but let's stick with that surgeon. Surgeon is responding abusively. The surgeon is saying, I'm not going to come in. Where does the nurse go from there?
In my experience, and what I've seen also in cases as well, is going to administration. So usually we have an OA on shift, every shift, even at nighttime. And if we can't get a doctor to come in, then we'll escalate to them, and they will either force this doctor to come in, or they can call their partner, and their partner would come in instead. And sometimes there's even, if we're talking hospitalists, internal medicine doctors, sometimes there's a doctor that oversees all of them. So he's kind of their supervisor for the shift, and we can go to that one instead. So it's really climbing that chain of command to let these people know that you're not messing around. You're trying to advocate for your patient. You're not trying to sit here, and there's no point in the back and forth, just come do what's right for your patient. And then if you want to go back to bed, you can go back to bed.
For those who don't know the abbreviation OA, could you spell that out for us?
I want to say operations administrator, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
It sounds like a good choice. That makes
Thank
sense.
you.
We might call them house supervisors. They could be a nurse, usually a nurse who is in charge of the hospital, who's the problem solver when there are situations. Maybe crises, maybe staffing issues. They get called when there are people who need some guidance. And there's ultimately a department chair who might not appreciate being woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning several times a month because the surgeon is not responding, who might then intervene and help this surgeon with their behavior. Ultimately, if the healthcare system is supposed to protect patients, we've got to start there. If our legal system is supposed to bring people justice whose rights were not protected, who got injured because of people's behavior, then the plaintiff attorneys become involved. And that often is where we become involved as legal nurse consultants, because there's got to be defense attorneys backing up the case from the other side. So we could be looking at these issues, finding them in the medical records, or worse yet, I've seen nurses who started off being deposed, asking about an events of when a patient deteriorated, and by their admissions in the deposition, they made themselves a defendant by what they said. Like, I knew this patient was deteriorating, and I was afraid to call the doctor. Well, now you have put a target on your back by what you said.
They're equally at fault. That's right.
Any last suggestions for legal nurse consultants in helping attorneys with these chain of command issues that we've been talking about? Anything you'd like to leave our listener with?
I think it's really reading between the lines in a way in the records. Who all is making notes on this patient while something is happening, while the patient's starting to deteriorate? Do you have your charge nurse? Okay. I think it's really looking at who all is actively in the chart while this patient's deteriorating. Who's leaving notes? Do you have your charge nurse leaving notes as well as the bedside nurse? Do you have additional staff nurses coming in? Because at that point, you can see there's this team effort going on, but they're not escalating. Why are they not escalating? And these are questions you can bring up, like you said, in deposition. And then are there orders being put in by different providers? Are there any orders at all? Why is your attending surgeon nowhere in the records? Maybe there's a reason for that. And maybe it's this retaliation, the bullying. I think it's picking up on just the little things of who's kind of sprinkling their own flavor into the records, who's leaving their notes.
I have also been focusing on the fact that there are now possibilities of getting phone messages, text messages, getting telephone records, phone records from defendant surgeons, from nurses who are working in the facility using a hospital communication tool that then reveals how many times they tried to reach this surgeon. In the case that I was describing to you about the bully, we were able to determine that the risk manager who testified that she didn't make any phone calls after she was informed about this catastrophic event in the delivery room involving the anesthesiologist. We got phone records that showed who she texted, who she called, that was directly in contradiction to what she testified about. And the attorney was able to confront the discrepancy between what she said she didn't do versus what she actually did. Also, as a side note, the medical director testified he didn't open up the medical record, and yet the chart audit showed he spent an hour and a half going through the records the next day and printed things, and it was all there on the audit trail.
The magical audit trail. That and the phone records are a very good point. And a lot of times your nurses don't document that they called the physician every single time they call the physician. A lot of times it's after they've tried to call them a bunch of times and they haven't answered, or it's when they finally get orders. So you don't see that they called them 6 or 7 times. It looks like they've called them once. So the phone records are a really, really good, powerful tool.
Absolutely. Catherine, I know that people are going to want to speak with you. I know that you do expert witness work, and you can also assist behind the scenes on critical care cases. What would be the best way for them to reach you?
My LinkedIn would be the best way. It's got all my contact information. You can message me as well. It's Catherine Andrades on LinkedIn.
And I'll spell your last name for people who are listening to the podcast. It's ANDRADES. Catherine's first name is with a C, not a K. It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast, Catherine. I've enjoyed exploring these issues. I know that you could tell us stories for the next 2 hours without pausing for a breath about situations that you've run into as a critical care nurse that have tested this patient advocacy concept. And as you pointed out, it is so important for our patient safety that nurses act as patient advocates so that we don't have these catastrophic outcomes that then end up, at least some of them, going into litigation.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Hang on next for a few more minutes so you can find out who is coming up next on Legal Nurse Podcast. And be sure to go to legalnursebusiness.com and take advantage of our new programs, upcoming events, the products that we provide for you to help build your business as a legal nurse consultant. It's all there at legalnursebusiness.com. We've also organized this website recently so that you can go with a specific question and then go directly to content that answers those questions. I'll see you on the next show. The next podcast is a bit of a departure from our usual pattern. You're going to see a program recorded at the Attorneys Resource Conference. In this session, I joined forces with seasoned attorney Sam Davis, Esquire, to unravel the story behind a catastrophic birth injury case. Together, we reflect on a journey that was almost 4 years long, in which we pursued this case and investigated it, and that journey challenged not only the hospital's policies and the actions of the staff, but also the very systems that were meant to protect patients. Listen in as we share the heartbreaking experiences of Eddie and Estefania, a young couple eagerly awaiting the birth of their daughter Emma, whose lives were transformed forever when a series of preventable medical errors led to Estefania suffering an anoxic brain injury. Through detailed analysis, expert witness opinions, and hands-on courtroom strategies, we reconstruct the timeline of a 40-minute window when everything went wrong. It spotlights the role of healthcare professionals, the tangled web of missing or altered medical records, and the hospital's contentious handling of a problematic anesthesiologist. This episode pulls back the curtain on the hidden dangers within our healthcare institutions, the importance of expert legal nurse consultants, and the relentless search for justice amidst institutional stonewalling. Tune in as we reflect on the lessons learned, the human cost of medical negligence, and the ongoing fight to hold individuals and hospitals accountable, all in pursuit of ensuring such tragedies never repeat. This is a podcast best viewed on our YouTube channel, Legal Nurse Business, to get the full benefit of the visuals we developed for this case. Coming up next on Legal Nurse Podcast. Thank you for being part of the Legal Nurse Podcast audience. I'm delighted that you've joined us for this episode. Be sure to go to legalnursebusiness.com and get your free reports, look around the website, pick up some tools that will be useful for you in your legal nurse consulting practice. And be sure to join us for the next episode. Welcome to Legal Nurse Podcast. This is your spot to get inspiration, tips, stories, and guidance to help you in your legal nurse consulting practice. I'm Pat Iyer, the host of Legal Nurse Podcast since 2016. We are among the top 5% of all podcasts in the world in terms of longevity and sharing information consistently week after week with legal nurse consultants. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.